Welcome to the library's first ever Poet to Poet interview with our poets Jessie Graves and Rita Quillen. We're so pleased to have these two very talented local writers here to treat us to a reading and discussion of poetry as they interview each other about their new books being released in October. The first poetry book to be released, coming out October 1, is Merciful Days by Jessie Graves. I have a picture of the cover, but that's unfortunate. I don't have the actual book, but I'll give you an idea. And Jessie is an ETSU English professor, poet in residence, and award-winning poet. In this fourth collection by Jessie, he examines the connections that hold people together across generations and through time and distance. And even though I'm from a different region than he speaks about, I felt it bringing me to childhood and felt the connections in all my senses. It was great. I read a phrase describing his book as written in a language that's both plain spoken and lyrical. And I agree, and I love that. Second poetry collection to be released this month is Some Notes You Hold by Rita Quillen. I think she has a copy of her book. It's due out October 22nd. Thank you. Rita's been a finalist in many award-winning award categories, and she's also written 2 novels and 5 other poetry books. This newest collection of hers is about surviving what life brings to us as we age. The journey she takes us on is so relatable, with beautiful descriptions, reminding us beyond the hard times, we can find a solace and peace distinctive to those who have lived much life. These 2 poetry collections are just lovely. Take it from me. Check them out through our library once they're released, or you can obtain them from your favorite bookseller. I'm excited for you to hear from these wonderful poets. And since his book comes out first, October 1st, I'm going to turn it over now to Jessie Graves to begin the readings and discussion.
Well, thank you, Pam, and Rita, of course, and thanks to JCPL for putting this together for us. I wish we were in that beautiful room that you have on the side of the building there in the library and with all of our friends, but I love that we still have the opportunity to talk about new work, and we're trying to keep the flame alive, in whatever way we can right now. And I'm really happy to share the screen with one of my favorite poets and someone whose poems I've learned a lot from and been reading for a long time now and admire them so much, Rita. So my book, I'm a little jealous, Rita. Your beautiful book is already in your hands, and I only have this big stack of paper still. Mine's supposed to be coming in next week, so. I'll get us started with a few poems, a handful of poems from my book, Merciful Days. And it comes out October 1st with Mercer University Press. I've worked with them for a couple collections now, and I love them. They really take care of their writers. I'm really proud to be working with them. Merciful Days, I think of as sort of the book of my mother's voice. And I'm going to read a few poems that maybe illustrate that for me, and hopefully they will for you listening. I'm going to start with one from sort of my childhood, you could say the end of my childhood, and about an event that some of you will remember maybe as vividly as I do. And the subtitle of this poem is For My Mother Turning 76. So this is just a couple of years ago. And the today in the second stanza of the poem refers to that day, her birthday, that we're spending together. You can see it on the page. It's maybe a little harder to hear that placement, but just hearing it out loud. But the poem is called Challenger. For my mother turning 76. Remember when we fed the cows from the window of the barn loft? We had the jumpy black Angus then, years before the docile polled Herefords who mill meekly about globe-eyed. Today the sun is out and we celebrate in short sleeves in early November and watch for leaves to drop from red orange maples. But that morning, blowing snow kept me home from school. We fed the square bales then, misshapen as they were, and I loved to cut the twine with the short blade of my pocket knife, taut forms loosening and scattering apart on the way to the ground below. Our mistake that day was to call the cows too soon. Sick calves, we said, just as my father said it. My father, who was on the road in hard weather, probably a 36-hour run to Harrisburg, driving through ice to get home by midnight. In half a second, it seemed the whole herd circled beneath us, grunting and jostling. And you said, "Shit, fire," which made me laugh so hard I lost my breath and could not even throw the hay out of the loft to distract them. We escaped, of course, and like so many other mornings after our chores, you said, "I think we need some biscuits, don't you?" "With apple butter," I said, and you held my collar as I climbed down the slick ladder. While cups of hot chocolate warmed our fingers, we turned to the one TV channel we could watch without static and saw a real rocket ship, like the model I wanted for Christmas, explode right on screen again and again in spiraling slow motion. I looked at you as I always did when I could not understand what I saw, and your mouth, frozen in mid-gasp, silently told me on the coldest day of the year that in a particle of that churning smoke departed the childhood I thought would last forever. So some of the some of you listening will remember the day the Challenger space shuttle exploded, and I think for people who were kids on that day and happened to be, I was home on a snow day, as I try to indicate in the poem, and for people who saw that happen, this was before the age of the 24-hour news cycle, and it was such a momentous, such an unbelievable thing to see and to happen. So the title of my book is Merciful Days, and I take that from a phrase that my mother has used my whole life. It's sort of a regional colloquialism, but like so many of those, it has kind of ambiguous meaning. Its meaning changes a little bit depending on the context in which it's used. I think that's so common in country speech and Appalachian speech. It's so much more subtle and nuanced than somebody from outside might recognize, and they might think it's simple or it's hard to understand, but nothing could be further from the truth. It's so subtle and nuanced, and I feel like this phrase is one of many that my mother uses that I feel like has such a richness to it. So I've tried to borrow it in her saying for this poem. The last couple of poems I'll read, my dad died in 2016, and that was a sort of huge loss for our family, and that's a sort of abiding presence across the collection of poems, elegies for my dad, who was truly the muse of my first book of poetry. So this is the title poem, Merciful Days. My mother and I walk the cattle trail alongside the family cemetery fence. Mid-February feels like late May with grass in the fields turning green. At a distance, a faint red tint appears along the branches of bare trees, like a chemical mist settling among them. False dawn promising new leaves. Just you watch, she says. Everything will bloom out, thinking springtime is here, and then we'll get a freeze. We make another round, circling the ones we love and have lost, separated by the breath we breathe and the dirt that covers them. She sighs, almost a word emerging through the air she pushes out, almost saying she is tired of it, the way it keeps moving through her. Merciful days, she says, meaning something I feel, but cannot begin to shape into words. And then I'll read one last poem. This is the final poem in the book. It's sort of the farewell to the reader and the farewell to this sort of moment in time, I guess you could say. It's called A Blue Tractor Passing. It was in New Holland or an older model Ford that we could hear coming for half a mile before it reached the house. When I asked my mother if she recognized the driver, a stranger to me, she said, I wish it was K.O. Campbell, and that your daddy was standing down there beside the road to throw his hand up at him. K.O. drove my school bus, in addition to the one blue tractor on Kane Road. Some years for Christmas, he brought us a bottle of his homemade wine, apple, pear, elderberry, which were the only spirits we ever kept in the house. K.O. outlived my father by just about a year, and now the Beeson family tends his orphaned herd. His bull still jumps the fence sometimes, and my nephews cross him back over while our cows bawl. Like my mother and me, these cattle keep looking for the old farmers who softly spoke their true names as they scattered salt into empty feed troughs. Thank you.
Beautiful. I loved this book, Jesse. I did. It's beautiful. It's about mining memory and confronting mortality and extolling family and just all these things that I really relate to. And of course, living on a farm, you and I have talked about that before.
Yeah.
That's a very unique experience in some ways, and it informs, I think, both our poetry. I've got a few questions for you.
Okay, yeah.
One of them is, I don't know if you were a fan of the TV show Downton Abbey.
Oh yeah, I've watched every episode.
Yeah, oh wonderful. Okay, so you probably remember the episode where our favorite character, the Dowager Countess, who was the queen of the one-liner.
Yeah, the weekend.
She's having dinner with the family one evening, and someone brings up the idea that someone that they know is a poet. And she immediately is horrified and she says, oh, no one wants a poet in the family. And I remember that I just died laughing because I knew exactly what she meant. It was in the context of, oh my goodness, these people tell everything. And your whole life and your family's life and all your memories and all the characters, that's all spilled out on the page. And I was thinking when she said that about that famous quote, I don't know if I've ever told you this story or not, but Jim Wayne Miller told me that when his second or third book came out, someone asked his father, they said, oh, have you read Jim's last book? And he just arched one eyebrow and said, I hope so. So my question for you is, as you write these books where you explore family and relationships and family history, and you tell true stories, how does your family react to that? And how do you react to that in a sense as an artist? How much does that consideration come into play when you write about family?
Oh, so much. That's such a great question because that's really, you can write about anything in the world, but I feel like for me, what I know best and what I feel the most, really simply is my family and the place where I grew up and the world as I've known it. And I think about this a lot. I told my mom that this book was more about her than the first book or two, and she said, well, you better make me look good.
Exactly.
I said, well, you always, how could I not? And she thought it was funny that I used that phrase "shit fire," which is another phrase of hers. That, I mean, everything she says is just poetry. It's just, she talks in
Right.
poems, and I just love it so much. And I think it took me a little while to write about her as much as I did in this book, because I talk to her every day, and that voice is just so much a part of my everyday experience. It was a little hard to separate it out into, poems. With my dad, I could always see the work that he was doing. I could always see him going off and coming back. And I heard, his stories of truck driving and traveling all over the country and all the crazy things he saw. And I think that to have poems written about him was probably not among the 10 million things he might have imagined would happen in his life.
I think my dad was the same way.
I think he was tickled by it in some way. I think he it was just sort of a quirky kind of thing that I don't think he would have ever expected to happen. And maybe enjoyed it in a way. I've thought about this with my daughter and my wife too. A lot of my poems are about when my daughter was little, and she's grown now, and so this is this is a little bit of a, you don't want to write too much about your teenage daughter's things that she says to you, and that you want to be mindful of people's own privacy in their own lives, and yet
Absolutely.
it's also our lives. It's what we experience too, and so I do think about it a lot.
Yeah,
I bet you think about it a lot too, don't you?
Oh, absolutely. I have the same issues, and the same thing. I wrote quite a bit about my children when they were very small. I'm very reluctant to do that now. I hardly ever bring them into it because that feels very invasive of their privacy. But I was just curious if other poets felt that way. You've led me into my second question, actually, very, very nicely. It's interesting, and I saw that, of course, as I read, that obviously you meant for this book to be so much about and for your mother, but your dad was such a strong presence, and there was a line in there about him that just absolutely knocked me out, and I felt like it was somehow central to this book, and I want to ask you to say a little bit more about it. And one of the poems you said, he left my life with the key still in his pocket.
Oh, yeah.
And that really, really struck me. To me, that's a door to a whole new book of poems. I don't know.
Oh.
I'm just curious about where that line came from. And do you think that when you finished this book, did you get the key back? Do you feel like you opened up something or learned something that you didn't see coming when you started these poems?
Rita, that's a great observation. That poem was maybe the hardest one in the whole book for me to finish and to write. It's called Nameless River, and it's pretty early in the book.
I could not remember the name of the poem.
And it was written pretty soon after he died, and I found myself trying to remember the name of the first man who gave him a job driving a truck. And I thought, I can hear him say it, I just can't quite. And I thought of all the memories that are sort of closed up now that he's gone, even no matter how many stories he told and how many times I listened to him talk about events or people. Some part of that is just, it's a locked room, and it will be forever. Yeah, it'll be forever lost. And that's when my dad was in home hospice for a long time, and my cousin Roger came over, and we were talking, and my dad was there in bed, and Roger said, "There goes a whole lot of history with him."
Yeah.
And I thought that's probably the real impetus for where that line came from, is that there's some of that is just, I can ask people what they remember, and I can try to write down everything I remember, but some of it, think of all the things we never share, and all the things that he knew, all the things that he knew and experienced that we'll never know. That was a hard poem to write.
Yeah, and the things that I think it's true probably for everybody, the universal aspect of all these poems is that all of us have some similar experience of thinking, oh, gee, I wish I had written down when Dad told me this. Or I
Yes.
wish I had paid more attention when he was showing me that. And when you're young, you're just, you're just a dither, and it doesn't occur to you to really stop and think, oh, wait, this might be my last chance to get this detail or this story. Yeah.
Right.
Well, I've got one more question for you, just a brief question. I'm always curious about, while you were writing this collection, was there any other poet or work that you felt like really fed into this or influenced you, or not? Sometimes people deliberately don't read other things while they're busy writing, and I'm just curious how it was in your case.
Actually, yes, and I'm glad you asked that, because I haven't had much occasion to talk about this poet, but I only in the last 4 or 5 years discovered the work, and she's actually still here. Her work is still here on my desk, of an English poet named Kathleen Rayne.
Oh gosh, I don't even know her.
Well, you could read a lot of anthologies and never find her. She's best known probably for her scholarship on William Blake's poetry.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
This is a book of her essays called Defending Ancient Springs.
Mm-hmm.
And it's about reading poetry and sort of taking care. Czesław Miłosz has a great phrase about poets tend the estate of poetry.
Mm-hmm.
And this book of Kathleen Rayne's is about that. And here is her collected poems. She lived to be way into her 90s, died within the last 15 years or so. One of her books that I have, and maybe it's this one, has a preface by Wendell Berry.
Oh, interesting. Okay,
Yeah,
well, I'll have to look her up.
Yeah, this one was published by Counterpoint Press, who's published most of Berry's recent poetry. And so, yeah, I love her work so much, and I don't feel like she's ever taught, and I don't feel like she's ever.
Right. I'm amazed that I've never even heard of her, and I really, you know me, I'm a lover.
I know,
and
yeah,
I try to
I
know
know,
all these
I
books,
know.
so I don't even know
Yeah.
her work. That's shocking. So I'll
Yeah.
definitely look her
Well,
up, and thank you for telling us about her. So
Absolutely.
if
Thanks
it's
for
somebody
asking.
I'm curious.
I'm glad to get a chance to talk about her work anytime I can.
Yeah. Well, that's all my questions. If there's
Well, thanks. I love those questions, Rita, and I appreciate them so much. I'd love to hear some of your new poems, or some of your poems from your new book.
Okay, I'm going to read Some Notes You Hold. It has a lot in common with Jesse's book in the sense that it's in 3 parts. The first part is an elegy to my father. He passed away about 8 years ago. And so the whole first section is about him and memories of him and my family and childhood. Then there's a little short section in the middle, a musical interlude, hence the title, Some Notes You Hold. And then the last part of the book is about moving on from grief and moving on with life and going back to all the things that always sustain and rejuvenate me and keep me sane, which is music and the farm and the land and my family, and particularly writing. So I'm going to start off with reading you a couple of poems about my dad. The first poem is called The Gospel of Junior, and it opens with a prologue that tells you what the Gospel of Junior is. And then the rest of the poems in that whole first section is kind of explaining to you with stories what the Gospel of Junior was. The book of Junior was economical, only needing a half-dozen commandments. Gardening is a sacrament, your tithe paid with hoe and bent back. Keep everything godly clean. Keep the Sabbath no matter what the hayfield says. In fact, go to church every time the door opens, but don't crow about it. Your life will tell the tale. Most of all, don't throw things away. Everything, all of it, is a gift. My dad's dime store dungeon of detritus down in his dark basement was a wonder. Nothing escaped him, not the broken or rusty, the warped or the worn. Dozens of nails driven in joists held bags of treasure. Screws, nails, nuts, and bolts, belts, brackets, brushes, and buckets, anything you could ever want or need, or never want or need. His underground hardware was a gold mine to the tinkerer or the child of depression. He could have bought new, but that's heresy in his anti-prosperity gospel. Living cheap is living humble. Transcendence is to be saved by what's broken. Sanctification sent by self-sufficiency. Grace from going without. Junior was that camel passing through that needle's eye every day. A piece of broken pipe in one hand, rusty wire in the other, his dusty broken down brogans with the recycled laces, shuffling down that redemption road. The next poem is from his love of gardening. He was famous for that. He loved his garden. So this poem is called Garden Rite, R-I-T-E. And throughout it, there's a liturgical quality to it. It has some lines from liturgy in it. I'm just going to hold my hand up when we get to those. And if you can read the poem, you'll see that it's in italics, but so you can hear that. Garden Rite. Each spring on his postage stamp of earth, the same rituals. At the first warm breeze, out came the two-by-fours, nailed together into a rectangle, where he tenderly pushed lettuce seeds into soft mud, draped the airy muslin covering over it all like a communion table waiting for the church bell, stepped back and smiled. Consecrate this crop. The days had to lengthen before the rest would join in. That old rusty push plow of his ancestors, a hoe he had kept from the barn of his boyhood, lifelong tie to the gardens of the dead. It is right to give thanks and praise. He used the creek and tree line in April to cite the straight line that would become, by the hot buzz of August, a choir of corn releasing soft hallelujahs. Beans would be kneeling women at the altar, onions the sour deacons of the doxology, squash women in yellow bonnets and calico of his youth, sweet fat cabbage babies wafting and waving in the blinding sun's light. We are what feeds us. He plunged little crosses in the ground where tomatoes smeared with the stigmata of juicy joy would shine over his garden. Not a thing wrong with the bread and wine, but a country boy had to have beans. No communion wafer unless it was made with ground corn. Let us keep the feast, lift up our hearts. And my father, the high priest of the scriptural lines of this bright, dusty kingdom, giving absolution with green garden hose in days of drought, would know precisely when to slowly lift that cloth from that communion table, pinch tender shoots to lay on his tongue, just the tiniest bite. Take and eat this refuge. This is all our salad days. I'm going to read you a music poem now. There's a whole series of poems in the latter part of the book about things I love and sometimes hate. And a lot of them center around music. So this is a poem about, well, I can't do it anymore. I'm too old, but why I used to love to dance, okay? So it's called Why I Dance. It's the lifting, defying the heron's physiology, the whoosh of the heft of all that weight, leaving gravity behind on the creek's glass face that I feel, lifted by the fiddler's hand, weightless for that split second when both left and right foot are off the floor. I lift my arms out like the climbing hawk, soaring over the still world beneath, moving through pockets of hot and cold air, floating like a note on the evening's breath. My hard heel beats like the woodpecker's beak on the old tree bones beneath me, drumming out the tune's heartbeat in a smiling choir of souls in motion. The fiddler and I lock eyes and smile, wordless, weightless, all at once, joyfully alive in buoyant youth. My feet and his hands together, warbler and chickadee rising to the dusk until the song ends, only the nightingale song ringing long and strong. And then like you, Jesse, I think I'll stop with the last poem in the book, where I sort of tried, without even realizing I was doing it, to put all of the things in this last section together, all the things that sustain me, the farm and writing and nature and family and all of it. The poem is called Fallow Fields because once this book was finished, I mean, it's finished. I have not written much of anything since then, which is interesting. That's the first time that's happened. So this is an interesting break. And here was the last poem that came, Fallow Fields. And so it is, this farm is 1,000 days of questions like, what's a meadow for? And all the other hackneyed metaphors for all the stones that look like faces, and the stones white as bones, and the fields covered in small shards of slate like broken hearts offering answers no one wants to hear. And so it is that the starlings and the bluebirds don't speak, have no use for one another, and the waxy soul inside the bee tree protects its heart from even hearing the hum, and the coyote pack howls to the heavens, pointing toward the silence. And so it is that the world wants dancing lines that burn like an open big butane singeing a gnarled palm, just pure stimulation, nothing slight or light or delicate, nothing that can be mistaken for old or patient, just blind rushing of syllables from the world's skin, not a thought in its head. And so it is I stand here dumb and useless in trampled fronds of something green and meaningful, unwilling to make sounds just for the sake of saying I did, letting frogs chorus on, birds shout letters and notes to indifferent air. And so it is that silence is my source, and I am blind as bark, and just as bound to woody phylum root tangles, dirt webs of time and loss, already in the past and the future at once, and you are wasting your time judging me. Already a dream or breeze or storm, just beyond your outstretched hand. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Rita, I love that poem so much. That's such a perfect concluding poem for this book.
Thank you.
Well, so I was super excited to see when I got the file for this new book that it's a new and selected volume of poems, which to me is like, that indicates something so meaningful about a poet's work. If you've been writing a while and published a few books, and somebody's interested in bringing together your whole, like a sampling of your whole body of work, that's really kind of a career accolade, a career recognition that there's really nothing else quite like that in poetry to me. So I was so proud to see that for you, and really happy about this being your new and selected poems. But I also thought how hard it would be, with all the excellent poems you've published, how hard it would be. Could you say a little bit? That's my first question, really, is tell us a little bit about putting this book together.
Well, when I began working on this book, obviously I returned after a kind of a little break back to writing poems about my dad. And I had published a little chapbook of poems right after he passed away. It's kind of more for myself and friends and family than anything else. But I wanted to go back and pull those in. But I also wanted to expand out from that and not make the book be so sad or all about just looking backward, or be, focused on death, but also focusing on life and the farm and nature and all the things that always sustain me about just continuing on, even in the face of something as devastating as my dad's sudden passing, So I began to write the poems that were about, well, how do you go on? And that's when I began a series of poems about things I love and hate. And I noticed that I kept coming back to music. So I thought, well, this can be a book then about healing and that about giving life purpose and meaning and, living the examined life and all those kind of things. It just seemed like a natural plan to do that. And so gradually working with, this book is from Madville Publishing, and that press is a new press, fairly new, started by the woman who was my editor at Texas Review Press when I published The Mad Farmer's Wife. And so she already knew kind of my work and my view of the world, and we were kind of on the same page. I don't know that, I could have done it with anybody else. She was great to work with. Kim Davis, she's a wonderful editor.
I love her too. I worked with her too.
Right.
Great
and so she just helped me, we just picked through poems and thinking about what makes this book work as a, I think of everything in terms of music. So I wanted this to work as a longer piece of, like a musical composition would, that it has these movements and moods in three three sections, and it felt like it all fit together. So that's how that came about.
Well, you've sort of foreshadowed my next question too, and which to me the main theme is this in this book and across your work. One of the two or three main themes has been the presence of music and the making of music. And I'm a little relieved you didn't jump up and start playing that stand-up bass behind you there.
That would be a bit much.
I've always got a little trepidation sharing the screen in this case with Rita Quillen, because you may not know what a wonderful musician she is. And I think, boy, if I read with Rita, I hope I get to go first, because she might start playing and singing and telling stories, and of course then you get forgotten about because you get to see Rita. You get to see Rita's whole show, and so I love to hear your music. And so, do you think being a musician has influenced the way that you write poems? And maybe also, could you say something about writing novels? I'll sort of merge two questions into one, because in the last few years you've published two novels. Which is really a delight to me to see that.
Oh, I appreciate that. Yeah, music is my absolute first love, and it is what keeps me sane. It always has been. Now I appreciate all the accolades. I'm not really that much of a musician as far as, now my brother was an amazing musician. He was like professional level, so I never did reach that level. I'm a person, I always tell people, I'm a music lover. That's a little different. And so I've learned to play a little bit, a whole lot of instruments, and I love to write songs when I can. I've turned a lot of my poems into songs, and that's been really fun. Now, so far, I have not done that with any of the poems yet from Some Notes You Hold. I don't know if that will happen or not. It's a very mysterious thing to me. Well, since I retired, I've been devoting most of my time to learning to play the mandolin, which is the hardest instrument I'd ever attempted. And so I've been working at that pretty hard for, 3 or 4 years now. And I'm getting, okay. I'm okay. I can hold my own, Nothing great for sure. But yeah, you can hear, and I went ahead and emphasized it in that poem, Why I Dance. You can hear me use musical beats. A standard 3/4 line or 4/4 line. You can hear that in some of my poems, and that's deliberate. And some people maybe like that, and some people don't. They think it's a little strange, but I just think it's fun, because I feel sure that music, the same stimulus and the same joy that I get from music, I also get from a finished poem. When I can accomplish that, it's the same rush of joy and satisfaction, and just, it's a kind of release. I don't know how else to explain it, but yeah, I'm very drawn to the rhythms of music and to the sound of words, not just their meaning, but the sound and how many syllables and how the beats work out. I'm very conscious of that. So, and I hope that comes across in my work, that you can hear that when it's read out loud. I hope so.
I think it totally does. Music and poetry, it's like they've been together since their births. They may not be twins, but they were born around the same time. I think
yeah, for sure.
They belong together. Well, I have one more question. You've written a lot about farm life and farm work and the beauty of it, and also the terror of it. It's not always just the pretty parts. And
sure.
to me, to me, I think this is one of the bonds that I feel to your work, and that I feel to you personally, and that you write about this world with such care and such attention. How do you think that came to be such a big feature of your work?
It's just what I've always done. I married a farmer, so I have always been out on the farm with these animals, and you have these experiences, like you said, they can be so wonderful, and they can be so horrible. As you know, I've written about losing animals, about losing that foal that I had waited for forever, that horrible form, one of the most horrible days of my life. But, in the midst of that too, that's what feeds my writing, is that sense of the eternal, and of things that are important, and things that are primal, It doesn't get more elemental than facing down a snake as you're walking through the woods, or whatever. That's,
Right.
that's metaphor coming to life, and you're dealing with it in your face. And so to then turn that around and use that for the energy to power through my poems, and to see that as I can use those experiences to go in any direction I want to. And as you know, if anybody who's read my work knows that a lot of these images, both the dark and the light stories, crop up in my work repeatedly. You won't see that image or that story just once. You'll see it over and over. And then you see it creep into my novels as well. But it's because I keep mining those experiences and trying to think about, how I thought about something 5 years ago or 10 years ago is very different from how I might think about it now. So I keep returning to those very elemental, basic experiences, interactions with sort of the eternal, and seeing how I think about it differently, 5 years later or 10 years later. So the farm is this place that to me suggests permanence and eternity. There's something about it that has this timeless quality that I hope I can capture in my writing as well.
Well, I think you've done that. It's the inexhaustible subject matter to me. And I think you have continued to find new ways to write about it and think about it. I've loved spending this time with you and hearing these poems.
You
and
too. This has
having
been
this
great.
conversation.
I love your new book, Jesse. I really do. Congratulations. It's marvelous. And I can't wait for everybody else to read it.
Yeah, I feel the same for yours. And I can't wait to hold yours in my hand too. And those are all the questions I have. So Pam, I suppose we'll turn it back over to you. And thank you again for.
Yes, thank you, Pam, for having me. I appreciate it.
Ah, what a delight this has been. Thank you, thank you, thank you to each of you, Rita Sims Quillen and Jesse Graves. And to everyone listening to this, go out and get their books. You will be glad that you did. And I'm just going to end it by saying thank you also to all who has joined us and been blessed by what they have to offer us. Thank you both.
Thank you, Pam, and thank you, listeners. I appreciate it. Thanks, Jesse.
Yeah,
Take care, everybody.